A pair of high heels. A couple of days ago, I found myself reading a discussion thread on a Discord server devoted to the paranormal and supernatural. The thread delved into subjects such as unexplainable and creepy sounds. According to people commenting, their experiences were true. Out of all the posts, there was especially one that piqued my interest. The person in question claimed that they had heard strange knocks coming from their attic. This went on for a couple of nights before they started hearing disembodied voices and whispers. Due to the nature of the server, the explanations were of a paranormal nature. The most popular theories regarded ghosts and spirits, while there were those that meant that it could very well be demons. I guess what I'm about to share also could be chalked up to something similar, but I'm not sure. In fact, I believe that it could be something even worse. But before I get ahead of myself, allow me to explain what actually happened to me back when I was 10 years old. It was the 90s. At the time, I was still living in my childhood home. It was a large, two-story, semi-detached house, quite modern for the time. We had a pretty sizable backyard where I would spend time outside of school with my friends. There was also a garden that my mother attended whenever she could, and where she not only grew flowers and plants, but also vegetables. All in all, it was a great place to grow up in. Looking back, I would say that I spent some of the best years of my life in that very house. There was nothing to fear. Never would I have thought that feeling could change, but it did. Something happened, something that would sully my idyllic youth forever. To be honest, relief washed over me once we moved, several years later. My older sister had recently moved out to live with her boyfriend. Left in the household was me, Mom, Dad, and my older brother, Sean. As per usual, Dad was away on one of his business trips. That evening, Mom and Sean were at the community center taking jitterbug classes. For the last couple of weeks, I'd been allowed to stay home alone. While it might only have been for a few hours here and there, it was a huge step towards independence for me. Since this was the age before cell phones, at least the readily available variety, and the internet, I had to go over to the neighbors if I needed something. I was seated on our couch in the living room upstairs, watching TV, with a full glass of soda and big bowl of snacks. As this was at least 30 years ago, I can't recall what movie was on, but I believe it was some sort of cheesy 80s action flick. My mother was very overprotective, and had she known I was watching something like that, she would have lost it. I suppose that's what made it more exciting. After all, I was breaking a sacred rule, but there was no one around to stop me. It was when I was about to head downstairs to refill my glass that I came to halt. My ears pricked up, as if they had caught something. Outside, the autumn rain poured without restraint. Something, probably a tarp of sorts, was flapping violently in the howling wind. Explosions, gunfire, and cheesy one-liners poured out from the TV sound system. I could hear my own breaths and the beating of my heart, both filling my eardrums. But although my senses were picking up an onslaught of sounds, none of them stood out as strange or unsettling. I figured that, as it was dark outside and I've only had the house to myself during daytime, that I was on edge. On a stormy evening like this, your mind had no issue playing tricks with you. The subtle feeling of tension soon faded, and I proceeded to head down to the kitchen for a refill. A few minutes later, I gently sunk down in the couch again, as to not spill the contents of my glass. However, it wouldn't take long before I thought I heard something again. It sounded like creaking. Must be due to the weather, I thought to myself. That said, something didn't feel right. Our house wasn't particularly old, and therefore, at least according to my underdeveloped reasoning, it shouldn't be possible. It brought to mind the sounds I would hear at my grandma's place, but the house she lived in was old, probably built in the 1930s. I took a sip and resumed to watching TV, but no more than 5 minutes later, I heard the creaking again. This time it felt like the entire building groaned, but instead of the sound dying down, it somehow remained, almost as if it was moving around. Somehow, the creaking felt sentient, like a blind person fumbling around in the dark. I might have been imagining things, but the floor had suddenly started to feel much colder. Growing up, I was never a particularly courageous kid. Sean made sure to remind me of that whenever he could. So instead of investigating the noises, I grabbed a blanket from the backrest of the couch, pulled it up to my chin, and turned up the volume. My eyes were fixed on the screen as I tried to block out everything else, but my attempts were fruitless. The creaking just kept going and going. Eventually, I decided to turn down the volume ever so slightly and try to determine what I was actually hearing. Through the downpour and the gale, I could hear things more clearly. Right next to us, separated only by a wall, lived our neighbors, a family of 5, of which 3 of them were kids either younger or much older than me. My parents were on good terms with the parents. For the most part, at least. Their kids were a whole other story. Every time they would get into an argument, it wouldn't take long before it all escalated into something reminiscent of a small-scale war. In fact, one of the kids' rooms, the teenager daughter's I think, was situated right next to the room I was in. I relaxed a little, convinced that I had solved the mystery. But just to be on the safe side, I put my ear to the wall and listened, certain that I would hear footsteps or at least someone blasting music, but I was met by dead silence. If it had been a normal day like any other, that would have been a relief, but this realization only raised more questions. I did, however, know of a way that would dispel my confusion and set the record straight, once and for all. My brother's bedroom window happened to face our front yard as well as the neighbors. The plan was to simply go and have a look, just to see whether or not the neighbor's car was parked on the driveway. I just needed to make sure not to disturb anything in Sean's room. Besides, he was a jock type of guy and I was a nerd, polar opposites, and hence I had no interest going through his stuff. I opened his door and looked in. The lights were out and I could make out the window on the opposite end. Without looking around, I snuck straight ahead, and once I had closed the distance, I peeked outside. Across our street I could see the trees moving violently in the wind. The rain was pouring down, so much so that a nearby gutter inlet had started to flood. For all the years I lived in that town, I had never seen anything like that. In fact, I was so mesmerized by what I was seeing that I almost forgot why I even entered Sean's room. But eventually, I focused my gaze on our neighbor's driveway. I furrowed my brow, no cars whatsoever. That's when I recalled something my mother had said earlier that day. Apparently, the neighbors were out of state to visit some relatives. In fact, they had asked my mother if she couldn't take in their mail, water plants, etc. while they were gone. Somehow, I had completely forgotten about that. Then again, I barely knew them, so who can blame me? Something else also became apparent to me. The noises I had heard earlier had now ceased. I wasn't sure what to believe anymore, but the more I looked out that window, the more I blamed the weather. Safe to say, it was really bad, and even if our house was fairly new, it was not sturdy enough to withstand the power of the elements. And with that, I went back to the living room, but also making sure that I closed the door to Sean's room. Back in the comfort of the couch, I pulled the blanket over me and tried to pay attention to the movie, but truth to be told, I was no longer up for it. My unease had made me sweat so much that my shirt was sticking to my skin. I also felt feverish. The air in the room felt stifling, making it harder to breathe. I shot a glance at the wall clock. 8:15 p.m. Now that I'm an adult, it's a bit embarrassing to admit, but at that moment I really missed my mom. Hopefully they would be home soon. A childish thought came over me. If I kept staring intently at the clock's hands, then maybe, just maybe, time would move faster. Keep in mind, I was a gullible 10-year-old who had no real grasp on anything outside of video games and movies. Said and done, I focused my gaze, trying to make the hands of the clock move faster by sheer force of will. Not surprisingly, it didn't have any effect. The more I strained my eyes, the more blurrier my vision became, and before I knew it, I dozed off, if only for a few minutes. With a violent, jerking motion, I all of a sudden sat up straight. At first I was unaware what had woken me from my slumber, but then I heard it, the footsteps. They had returned. Something was different though. I can't tell whether this minor detail had always been present or if I just now had taken note of it. The steps had this clicking sound to it, as if someone was wearing shoes. Not only that, I was now made aware of exactly where the sounds were coming from. Cautiously, I slowly turned to face my parents' bedroom. The door stood ajar. What lurks beneath the surface of Saskatchewan? Ever wonder what is in the earth? Most would think of the worms and bugs that crawl around in the soil. Others would think of the many dead, man or not, that took their last breath before becoming part of the earth again. Some would imagine the burrows made by animals like rabbits or badgers to provide shelter. A few would think of the hot rock deep below, ever so churning. For me, the earth below us is a place for something else entirely. I shudder to remember all of my experience, but I had to sow that it is out there as a warning to others if they were to experience a similar situation. For most of my life, I have lived in a hamlet in Saskatchewan. I will not tell its name as I do not want anyone to experience what I had experienced, but I will try to put context so that it makes sense to anyone who would be in a similar situation to mine. The hamlet was at one time a town, relying on the railway to provide for its residents and businesses. It was that way until a fire in the early 1920s that destroyed half the town. I do not know how many people died in the fire, however, what is known is that the hamlet never got to its former glory. The only people who lived there were either the religious Mennonites or people who wanted a simpler life. I was part of those who wanted a simpler life, of which I grew up here since I was still an infant since my parents moved from the city of Saskatoon. While I do have a few fond memories, all that I did is do chores and watch TV, while also going to school in another town a few miles from here. We don't farm, unlike those outside of the hamlet. We are more like one of those people whose parents had worked somewhere else. Overall, in this hamlet, almost everyone knew who everybody was, except for me. During my free time, I would read a few nonfiction books and draw maps that would pop out in my antisocial teenage head. In summer, I would go outside and explore the natural world and the hamlet itself. The weird thing I should mention is that our house is the only one of 2 surviving structures that survived the fire, which is an achievement in itself. The other is an abandoned brick 3-story schoolhouse a block away to the south. It is built in the mid-1910s and abandoned sometime in the 70s, maybe because of a lack of funding to keep operations going. It was bought out by many owners, people like us, but wanted their life to be a little more grandiose, but every time, they would either move out or disappear without a trace. We always assumed the ones gone likely moved out without any of us knowing. I was no different. I used to think that the reason they moved out is because it is difficult to maintain, at least cost-wise. I have heard that water, heating, and plumbing are the main problems, at least what I thought. I would occasionally hear, at least, the bells going off from the schoolhouse, most times when it was supposedly unoccupied. I thought it was the Mennonite kids sneaking into the building to cause a bit of grief upon the town. How wrong I was. It all began during a snowstorm, of which I was sleeping in my bedroom. It was very cold, as we had been struggling with water heating at the time, so I tried to stay warm using hand warmers, which I am not supposed to use under this circumstance, but there is really no other way. I was in a shallow sleep until I heard something amongst the howls of the wind. At first, I thought it was just the wind until I strained my ears to listen closer. I could recognize a scream, not the one you would find in horror movies when someone is being killed, but rather an animal in agony, like a cow or something. Usually, if this was the case, coyotes would be yapping around, attacking the animal and sound off their victory cries. Instead, there was nothing else other than those sounds and the near-deafening wind. I think it lasted for a few minutes before it stopped. The next morning, there was no school, but that was the least of my concerns. One of our farmer friends, Bob, called my mother to say he was missing a few cattle from his pasture, which is on the other side of my house, across the gravel road. He did come over and asked us, along with our buddies, to try and look for the cattle, dead or not. The fresh snow, however, would make this task difficult as the remains of the cattle would be buried in the big snow drifts formed from last night. Eventually, we did find one of the cattle. The dead cow itself was found in one of those islands of trees that pop along the emptiness of the snowy plains, protected from the wind so snow does not accumulate much. The mere sight of it made me feel so weak I wanted to just fall, and, as far as I could recall, one or two of the others fell sick once they saw the sight of the carnage. The thing that bothers me about the snow-covered carcass is that it looked so unrecognizable that you would think that it was a long-abandoned deer carcass, with flesh being ripped from the bones and a leg a far distance away. The only way Bob could have known that it was one of his cows was a tag, still attached to the head that is a good distance away from the body. When we found it, it was positioned perfectly on a stump, as if somebody placed it on the stump to relay some strange warning. It also seemingly had its eyes gouged out and tongue ripped out, like the head that was violently torn from the body. We were disturbed by the sight of such ruin. We assumed only a poacher could do this. The sight left us with many questions, and any known evidence we could have found would be buried in snow, and we still have a few missing cattle to find. Bob reported to the police, which they arrived there a while later. Even they were baffled by the sight of it when it led to it, but they chalked it up to some wild animal attack, explaining a bear could do this. Bob wasn't happy with the explanation, pointing to the perfectly placed head on the stump as a counterpoint that a poacher killed the cow rather than some bear. Either way, the police did warn us to look out for any dangerous animals in the area, and Bob cleaned up the remains. Me and my mother returned home only to talk about the sight we saw. I did not sleep well after that. I always felt watched while I slept, as if there was a presence looking at me through the window. Every time I looked, there was nothing there at the window. At the same time, I would also hear sounds coming from the roof of our house, but I chalked it up to be the few feral cats that usually climb the trees and live on the roof. Over the next few days, I noticed a decreasing number of cats. At first, I wouldn't notice since we usually feed the cats outdoors, and any cats missing would reappear. It seems those we do not see stay unseen. We worry something might be happening to them, like a pack of coyotes or even someone feeding them windshield fluid, but we do not see the bodies. I counted at least 6 of them gone, likely more. That was until 5 days after the cow killing when something came up. In between our house and the schoolhouse is the villa, or a place where the old go to be taken care of. The reason for the villa to be there is, at least what I thought, simply down to the fact the elders wanted a simpler life, like the rest of us, Mennonite or not, for the rest of their days. Today, however, things are getting more complicated than anyone could handle. As far as I heard, on that morning, one of the people there walked down the driveway at the villa and saw something right around the tree. He went closer and realized that there are objects around the tree within the red-stained snow. The man noticed something terribly wrong with what he is seeing. What he was seeing is 7 poorly severed heads of cats within blood-stained snow, and he looked up to see their torn bodies hanging in the bare tree branches. He turned to call out the others on this grisly spectacle, and more people surrounded the tree. Even the neighboring Mennonites went to see the sight, only to recoil at the mere sight of it. The police eventually arrived, and this time they cleaned up the scene, leaving behind a tree surrounded by blood-stained snow. This was told to me by Barney, one of our neighbors who went to the scene. He stated that he thinks somebody is killing the animals for the fun of it, while also thinking this is somehow connected to the missing cows. I was struggling to comprehend who or what is doing this or the actual reason behind this. I went outside to look at the blood-soaked snow that moats around the tree. As I looked from the entrance to the villa, I started to think the cats weren't killed by the tree, as there was seemingly no sign of a struggle in the snow. It looked like the cats were placed there, as there were no splashes around the pool. I tried to look for tracks, but what would be left of it seems to be trampled by the many footsteps of those who visited. As I was walking back to my house, I heard someone yell out something from a distance away. I turned to see a middle-aged man, dressed in jeans and a plaid button shirt with a coat, walking sternly towards me in the road. I recognized as one of the neighbors, but he looked like he was mad or something. I was looking on in a confused stance as he walked up to me, grabbed me by my sweater, and angrily told something in his angry twang that the devil has come to town. I was held up for a few seconds until Bob broke it up and argued with the guy. Eventually, he walked away and Bob assured me everything is going to be okay. That is not where it ends. Strange remains and animals are still being reported, and each more bizarre. In another area nearby, at another of those tree islands, somebody found a site of a pile of dismembered coyote corpses. To the north, there was also a report of 3 dead horses whose bodies are torn up. The heads were missing until they were found nearby in a triangle configuration, disturbing those who saw the sight. Ever since that, more animals in the area disappeared. It even got so bad people won't let their pets alone in fear they may go missing. Police began to think that a few sick individuals are involved. However, the only proof is the crime done. By this point, no one knew who the suspects are. That was until one night. When I was trying to sleep in my room, I heard a tapping through the window that is facing towards the pasture.